Okay, welcome back. So, Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340 to 1400, and the writer of, the creator of the Canterbury Tales, one of the greatest poems ever written, and also Troilus and Cresside, but of course nothing surpasses the Canterbury Tales. These are the most widely known of Chaucer's poems, who also wrote 40 ambitious dream allegories, two of which were left unfinished. His life was crowded with public business, ranging from soldiering in France and carrying out diplomatic missions in Italy to serving as a member of parliament from Kent, as controller of customs of the port of London, and as the clerks of the king's works, in charge of docks, walls, bridges, sewers, and the lower Thames. The England where Chaucer played his many roles was in transition, remember, between Middle Ages and the modern world. The feudal system still existed, but it was becoming increasingly easy for for those from the lower orders to run away from the estates where they belonged and find employment in the cities or with the sellers market in labor. There was also something called Black Death, okay, when there was a big plague caused by the unhygienic conditions in London, too many wars and then plague, so the Black Death, and all these things caused a sort of change in the social structure of the country. People started at least aspiring for upward social mobility. So, Chaucer was writing during that period. The king of course still exerted tremendous power, but the rise of several cities and of large scale manufacturing and trade, all these had created a wealthy and influential aristocracy, nobility, a kind of middle class of merchants and artisans who also started participating in governing the country and also uh, having some kind of stakes in the great city of London. The royal court was not only a source of power and pageantry, the royal court, when you will do Elizabethan period, you will understand the pageantry that was that would exist during those periods. It was still the court was still, in spite of its power and proclivity towards pageantry, was still an arena for artistic and intellectual discussions. Okay, so all these things were happening when Chaucer was writing. Complex issues such as the Hundred Years' War with France, and this particularly caused a sense of, or produced a sense of national consciousness, which was quite different from the early regional and personal loyalties that existed in England. It still existed, but things started changing. People started having a sense of national identity. Chaucer's father was one of the rising middle class, a wine merchant with some connections at court. Chaucer acquired a good deal of knowledge of bookkeeping, civil law, philosophy, astronomy, and learned to handle French, Italian, and Latin competently. Coming to his literary production. Now, customarily, we divide Chaucer's literary production into three periods: French period, Italian period, and English period. English period is most important, 1386 to 1400. The Canterbury Tales belongs to the English period and is dominated by the contemporary English scene, but still owes a great deal to both French and Italian models. Chaucer began his literary career under the influence of a medieval French literature, which included satires, romances, fabulas, and contemporary poets such as Deschamps, Menchon, and Froissart. So, all these are the great French writers um, who had some kind of influence on Chaucer. Under French influence, he started his translation of Roma de la Rose, that is Romance of the Rose, and more important, produced his first ambitious original poem, The Book of the Duchess in 1369, which is an elegy on the death of Blanche, the wife of Chaucer's patron John of Gaunt. Remember these names. Blanche, it's an elegy on the Blanche, the wife of Chaucer's patron John of Gaunt. It's written in the form of manner of the then contemporary French poets. The work is also distinct for the use of the setting to intensify the dream-like mood of the poem, the sense of immediacy in the portrait of the grieving knight that could be the patron, and the flashes of psychological insight. So, very often in competitive exams you may be given a passage and then you may be asked that what is the literary theory, or what example of literary theory or criticism can you find. So, you have to be sensitive to those also. Keep revising your archetypes, your psychoanalytic theory, your structuralism, your post-structuralism. Okay. So, all these may find their way into these exams. The poems of Chaucer's Italian period show progress in his mastery of rhetoric, technique, style and metre. For example, the House of Fame, the Parliament of Fowls and the Legend of Good Women. These are dream allegories containing many of the old familiar features of French literary type, but Chaucer breaks with the conventional pattern by his broader range of ideas, subtlety of characterizations and humorous detachment, which is the Italian influence. In the House of Fame, the poet is carried by an eagle to the House of Fame, where he is to hear important tidings of love. In the Parliament of Fowls, we learn how the birds assemble on Saint Valentine's Day to choose their mates, and the courtly and chivalrous eagles, okay, and common sense duck and romantic dove. So, all these are animals, okay, they are all representative of parliamentarians. So, these are exemplars of comic satire. In the Legend of Good Women, you find a remarkably fresh and original prologue telling how Chaucer came to write a set of accounts of women who were faithful in love even unto death. So, that is Chaucer for you. The great masterpiece of this period, the Italian period, is Troilus and Cressida. It is based on a narrative poem by Boccaccio and follows the conventions of courtly love. Courtly love is another literary device or a term that you should know. Coming to the Canterbury Tales. In the Canterbury Tales, we find immediately a kind of difference between the other periods and this period. The English influence may not be a literary one like the French and Italian, but is simply the influence of the breadth, scope and zest of Chaucer's own England and time. So, it is very much of its zeitgeist and milieu. The specific literary references are still French, how would they not be? But there is French, there is Italian, there is Latin, all these influences, but the setting is no longer in dream worlds or in ancient Troy. That is what he was doing. It is on the road between London and Canterbury. Into this setting, Chaucer would pour the whole wealth of his reading, his knowledge, his experience of men, women and his great humour. The Canterbury Tales is a group of stories, mostly in verse, written by Chaucer in the closing years of the 14th century. The frame tale is Chaucer's most comprehensive and absorbing tale. This is a kind of a frame tale, tale within tales, the product of his fullest genius. His prologue is the frame which establishes what the writer or what the poet is setting out to do. He meets some 29 or 30 people at the Tabard Inn and joins them to make a pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas a Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. That is the plot. At the suggestion of the innkeeper, the host, who has made himself the master of ceremonies, each pilgrim agrees to tell 4 stories, 2 on the way to Canterbury, 2 on the way home. So, 4 stories. Each person tells you 4 stories. So, the host is to decide which is the best tale, and the travellers are to reward the winner with a banquet. So, Chaucer's scheme calls for 120 to 124 tales, but the plan was never carried out. Only 23 pilgrims have their turns, and all that survive are 20 complete tales. We have 2 incomplete also, the Squire's tale and the Cook's tale, and 2 which are deliberately left unfinished, most notably the Monk's tale. Okay? So, when the narrators are silenced by the group. In the general prologue, Chaucer describes each pilgrim, later adding further details and characterization as the frame tale develops. So, it is a brilliant study of characterization, how early literature started developing characters. From the beginning, Chaucer's originality is apparent. A few graphic details and a pilgrim is right in front of you. You can actually picturize mentally picture the person, the irritable, belligerent miller who can butt down a door, who has a wart on his nose from which grows a tuft of red hairs, and the cook who suffers from an inflamed ulcer. Even when following earlier writers, Chaucer was an innovator. He introduced Italian literature to England. He was the first to use many of the meters and stanza forms which have become standard in English poetry. He was the first English poet to deal extensively with the contemporary scene. You should also know that he was buried in the Poets' Corner of the Westminster Abbey. Just now I was talking about courtly love. Here is an example of courtly love. Look at the slide here. There is a beautiful video here of courtly love. Now, coming back to Chaucer, remember that it comprises particularly the Canterbury Tales, which is something that is repeatedly asked in competitive exams for literature. So, you can look at the major tales. Okay, go to the net, look at the major tales in the Canterbury Tales, and then take a look and what they stand for, what is the theme, who are the characters, who is the speaker, and get a hang of it. Next is next important work of this time is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Again a medieval romance, anonymously written. It's a part of the medieval romance tradition, which means it focuses on the journey or quest of a single knight, Sir Gawain, and what he learns about himself and his culture in the process of pursuing a great adventure. He meets a mysterious green knight and accepts the challenges of that green knight. Sir Gawain was written in northwestern England in the late 14th century. It is very, it's typical of its age, very medieval. Sir Gawain was written in English, but not the kind of English that would be recognizable to modern readers. But still you have to understand it is written in a dialect of Middle English. It is called Northwest Midland. Middle English was not as much standardized as English has become today. It has a lot of loan words from Welsh. Sometimes you may be asked to identify that kind of those lines from the Old English. You will have to understand some of the loan words, very common loan words that can appear occur in these kinds of um, poems. Okay, so when you look at Beowulf, when you look at Sir Gawain, okay, there would be even in Chaucer. I mean, Chaucer is usually credited with he is for ushering in the era of standard English. Okay, so that's the beginning sort of. So you have to look at all this and see, but and should be able to identify some common words. Okay, this is a question that may appear. You don't have to be a reader or a master of the Old English, but it helps if you know some of the words, because you never know, examiners may set a question where the original passage in original Old English may appear before you, and they may ask you to interpret the meaning. It's a very simple looking sentence. It's in English, you know the alphabets, but you don't understand how it is spelled. You should be able to understand at least or know at least some of the words, very common, frequently occurring words. Know the conjunctions, know the prepositions, know the articles, how they were written then. Sir Gawain has also words from Anglo-Saxon, the language is spoken in England before it started getting influenced by the French language. And here is a slide that I would like you to look at, a video, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I am insisting on videos because that way you will be entertained. Of course, it will give you an additional resource of understanding literature. You will also understand the way words were pronounced during those days. The BBC documentary. And before winding up today's lecture, I am going to, I would like you to look at this also, how English has developed down the years. Look at the slide here. What we did in today's class was just a little bit of warm up, a kind of introduction to to some major writers and their works, some literary devices. We also did some practice tests. We will be doing more of this in our subsequent classes. I suggest you start going through all these writers and their works. This could be very, very intense and exhaustive, and it is definitely time consuming. So therefore, if you are serious about taking such exams, you have to start early. Thank you very much. We will meet again for our next class.